I'm Amber Collins, 26 years old, and I'm standing in my family's kitchen watching my sister Stephanie receive another round of applause for being absolutely perfect. She just announced her acceptance to Harvard Medical School and her engagement to David, a wealthy corporate lawyer who drives a BMW and owns property in Manhattan. Everyone's raising their champagne glasses, patting her shoulders, telling her how proud they are. Meanwhile, I'm invisible in the corner, holding my beer and trying not to let my face show how much this hurts. Then my mother Helen looks directly at me with that disappointed expression I know so well and says loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, at least one of my daughters has her life figured out." Before we dive into what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Are you someone who's ever felt like the overlooked child in your family? If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Trust me, what my family did to me next will shock you to your core. So stick around, because this is just the beginning of how I went from being the family disappointment to exposing their darkest secrets. Growing up in the Collins household meant living in Stephanie's shadow every single day of my life. From the moment we were old enough to walk, it was clear that my parents had already decided which daughter was worth investing in and which one was just taking up space. Stephanie was 2 years older than me, and by the time I started kindergarten, she was already being hailed as the family genius who could do no wrong. I remember being 7 years old and bringing home a painting I'd made in art class. I was so excited to show my parents this colorful landscape with purple mountains and orange trees that my teacher had praised as wonderfully creative. But when I ran into the house with my artwork, my father Robert barely glanced up from helping Stephanie with her advanced math homework. "That's nice, sweetie," he said dismissively, "but Stephanie needs help with her multiplication tables for the gifted program." My mother Helen took my painting and stuck it on the refrigerator without even looking at it, then immediately turned her attention back to discussing Stephanie's academic achievements. Meanwhile, Stephanie was getting private tutoring in every subject imaginable. My parents spent hundreds of dollars every month on SAT prep courses, piano lessons, tennis coaching, and academic enrichment programs. When I asked if I could take art classes at the community center, my mother laughed and said, "Art is a nice hobby, Amber, but it's not going to pay the bills." The message was crystal clear. Stephanie's interests were investments in the family's future, while mine were just expensive distractions. The favoritism became even more obvious as we got older. In high school, I tried desperately to find something that would make my parents notice me. I joined the track team and actually became quite good at long-distance running, but when I made varsity as a sophomore, my parents missed my first meet, because they were attending one of Stephanie's academic award ceremonies. I taught myself to play guitar and wrote songs, but my mother would tell me to keep it down, because Stephanie was studying. I even tried to excel academically, pushing myself to get straight A's in my junior year, but all I got was a pat on the head and a comment about how I was finally applying myself like your sister always has. Stephanie, for her part, seemed to enjoy the dynamic. She had this subtle way of undermining me that my parents never noticed. She would accidentally spill things on my homework, causing me to have to redo assignments at the last minute. She would volunteer to help me with projects, and then make suggestions that would sabotage my work. Once, I had spent weeks preparing for a science fair with an elaborate display about renewable energy, and Stephanie convinced me to change my presentation the night before to something she knew wouldn't work. When my project failed spectacularly, she was there with sympathetic hugs, while my parents shook their heads in disappointment. The family narrative was set in stone by the time we were teenagers. Stephanie was the investment, the pride and joy, the daughter who would make the Collins name mean something. I was the disappointing one, the daughter who was still figuring things out, the one who would probably need financial support well into adulthood. Every family gathering became an opportunity for my parents to showcase Stephanie's achievements, while I sat quietly in the background, trying to become invisible. Now, at 26, I was working as a freelance graphic designer, barely making ends meet in my tiny studio apartment across town. Stephanie was finishing her pre-med requirements with a perfect GPA while planning her wedding to David, whose family owned a successful real estate development company. My parents talked about Stephanie's future with pride and excitement, discussing her medical school plans and her upcoming marriage as if they were personal achievements. When people asked about me, they would smile awkwardly and say I was exploring my creative side, or taking time to find herself, as if being an adult with a career in design was some kind of extended adolescent phase. The worst part wasn't just being overlooked. It was watching my parents actively discourage my dreams while celebrating every breath Stephanie took. They had never once asked to see my portfolio, never shown interest in my client work, never acknowledged that I was actually supporting myself through my art. In their minds, I was still the little girl with the messy painting that wasn't worth hanging up properly, while Stephanie was the shining star who validated all their parenting choices. 3 weeks after Stephanie's engagement party, my grandmother Rose passed away suddenly from a heart attack. Grandma Rose had always been different from my parents. She was the one person in my family who had actually encouraged my artistic pursuits. She would spend hours looking at my drawings when I was little, asking me to explain every detail, and telling me stories about famous artists who started just like me. When I decided to pursue graphic design, she was the only family member who congratulated me instead of suggesting I choose something more practical. The funeral was a somber affair, but I noticed Stephanie seemed more concerned about how the black dress she'd chosen would photograph than about actually mourning our grandmother. During the service, she kept checking her phone and whispering to David about their wedding plans, as if Grandma Rose's death was just an inconvenient interruption to their perfect life timeline. 2 days later, the family lawyer called us all to his office for the reading of Grandma Rose's will. I honestly hadn't expected to inherit anything significant. I figured whatever money she had would go to my parents, or be split equally between Stephanie and me. My parents certainly seemed confident about what they would receive, discussing their plans to use Rose's nest egg to help pay for Stephanie's medical school tuition. The lawyer, a kind elderly man named Mr. Peterson, who had known our family for decades, began reading through the standard legal language about assets and beneficiaries. Most of Grandma Rose's possessions went to my parents as expected: the house, her car, her jewelry, and the majority of her savings account. Stephanie inherited Grandma Rose's china set and some family heirlooms. Then Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and looked directly at me. To my granddaughter Amber Collins, he read, "I leave the sum of $50,000, to be used specifically for pursuing her artistic dreams and building the creative business I know she has the talent and determination to succeed with. Amber has always had a special light that this family has failed to nurture properly, and I want her to have the chance to shine as brightly as I know she can." The silence in that room was deafening. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I had just heard. $50,000. $50,000 specifically for me, specifically for my art, specifically because my grandmother had believed in me when no one else did. I looked around the room and saw 3 faces staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to barely contained fury. Stephanie was the first to break the silence. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Grandma was getting forgetful toward the end. She probably didn't understand what she was doing. But Mr. Peterson assured us that the will had been written 6 months earlier when Grandma Rose was in perfect mental health, and that she had specifically requested this particular bequest. My father's face was turning red with indignation. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. Amber doesn't need that kind of money for her little art projects. Stephanie has medical school debt to think about, real expenses for a real career. My mother nodded emphatically, already calculating how they could convince me to share the inheritance with my sister. The ride home was uncomfortable, to say the least. My parents spent the entire drive explaining to me how selfish it would be to keep all that money for myself when Stephanie had such important educational expenses. They pointed out that Stephanie's career would benefit the whole family, while my artistic phase was just a personal indulgence. They suggested I could give Stephanie $30,000 and keep $20,000 for myself, which they framed as incredibly generous on their part. But for the first time in my life, I felt like someone in my family had actually seen me for who I was. Grandma Rose had left me that money because she believed in my talent and my dreams. She had watched my parents dismiss and discourage me for years, and she had decided to give me the chance they never would. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I was going to use every penny of that inheritance to open my own design studio, and I wasn't going to let my family talk me out of it. When I announced my decision at dinner the next evening, the reaction was explosive. Stephanie burst into tears, claiming I was being cruel and selfish after everything the family had done for me. She reminded me of all the times my parents had supported me financially over the years, conveniently forgetting that most of that support had been basic necessities, while she received luxury tutoring and enrichment opportunities. My parents accused me of being ungrateful and short-sighted, warning me that I would regret this decision when my business inevitably failed and I had nothing to fall back on. I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer the next day to make sure the inheritance was legally mine alone. When I discovered that Grandma Rose had structured the bequest in a way that made it impossible for my family to contest or claim any portion of it, I felt a surge of gratitude for my grandmother's foresight. She had known exactly what my family was like, and she had protected my inheritance from their manipulation. The family dinner that followed my legal consultation was the first real battle in what would become an all-out war for my independence and self-respect. With my inheritance secured, I threw myself into launching Creative Canvas, my own graphic design studio. I found a small but charming office space in the Arts District downtown, complete with large windows that flooded the workspace with natural light. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was building something that was truly mine, something that reflected my vision and creativity rather than my family's expectations. The initial response to my business was incredibly encouraging. Through my existing freelance network, I managed to land 3 major clients within the first month. A boutique restaurant chain that needed a complete rebranding, a non-profit organization launching a fundraising campaign, and a tech startup looking for innovative website design. Each project allowed me to showcase different aspects of my skills, and I found myself working with more passion and energy than I had ever experienced. My portfolio was strong, featuring logos I had created for local businesses, website designs that had significantly increased client engagement, and marketing materials that had helped small companies expand their customer base. I had testimonials from satisfied customers praising not just my technical skills, but my ability to understand their vision and translate it into compelling visual communication. For the first time, I felt like I was proving to myself and the world that my artistic abilities could indeed pay the bills and build a successful career. But my family's reaction to my early success was far from supportive. Instead of congratulating me on landing major clients, or asking to see my work, they seemed almost annoyed that my business was getting off the ground at all. My mother would make snide comments about playing office whenever I mentioned client meetings, while my father questioned whether I was really making any profit, or just spending Grandma Rose's money on an expensive hobby. Stephanie's response was the most troubling. On the surface, she acted supportive, congratulating me on my clients and even offering to help with any business advice I might need. But I began noticing strange coincidences that should have been red flags. First, the restaurant chain called to cancel their contract, citing concerns about my reliability and professionalism that seemed to come out of nowhere. When I pressed them for specifics, they mentioned receiving a phone call from someone claiming to know my work history, warning them that I had a pattern of missing deadlines and delivering subpar work. The accusations were completely false. I had never missed a deadline in my freelance career and had built my reputation on exceeding client expectations. But the restaurant owner seemed convinced by whoever had contacted them, and no amount of portfolio evidence or reference letters could change their mind. I lost not just that contract, but also the substantial final payment that would have covered my studio rent for 3 months. 2 weeks later, the non-profit organization called with similar concerns. They had received an anonymous email with detailed claims about my unreliability, including fake examples of previous projects where I had allegedly caused problems for clients. Again, these claims were completely fabricated, but the organization decided they couldn't risk their fundraising campaign on a designer with questionable credentials. They terminated our contract immediately, leaving me with only one remaining client and a rapidly shrinking bank account. I knew these weren't coincidences, but I couldn't prove who was behind the sabotage. The phone calls and emails were untraceable, and the false information was sophisticated enough to sound believable to people who didn't know my actual work history. I started to suspect that someone close to me was orchestrating these attacks, but I couldn't bring myself to believe that my own family would go to such lengths to destroy my business. My suspicions were confirmed when I overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. I had stopped by my parents' house to pick up some old art supplies from my childhood bedroom, and I heard Stephanie talking in the kitchen. At first, I thought she was discussing her wedding plans, but then I heard her mention my business name. I crept closer to listen and heard her giving detailed instructions to someone about which lies to tell my remaining client to ensure they would drop me as well. Make sure you mention the missed deadlines and the attitude problems, Stephanie was saying. These startup guys are really paranoid about working with unreliable vendors. So if you emphasize that she's difficult to work with and might cause problems for their launch timeline, they'll drop her immediately. She paused, listening to the person on the other end, then continued, "No, she doesn't know it's us. She's too naive to figure it out, and even if she does, who's going to believe that her own family would sabotage her precious little business?" I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. My own sister, the person I had grown up with and shared a childhood with, was systematically destroying my business and my reputation. She wasn't just competing with me or trying to prove herself superior. She was actively working to ensure my failure so that I would be forced to give up my independence and return to the role of family disappointment. When I confronted Stephanie later that evening, she denied everything with such convincing sincerity that I almost doubted what I had heard with my own ears. She claimed I was being paranoid and stressed from the business pressures, suggesting that maybe I had made mistakes with clients and was looking for someone else to blame. She even offered to help me find new clients to replace the ones I had lost, painting herself as the concerned sister trying to support my dreams. But the damage was already done, both to my business and to my relationship with my family. My remaining client did indeed cancel their contract the next week, citing the same fabricated concerns about my professionalism. Within 2 months of opening Creative Canvas, I had gone from 3 major clients to 0, and my inheritance was rapidly depleting as I struggled to pay studio rent and business expenses without any income. The worst part wasn't even the financial loss. It was the realization that my family's disapproval of my dreams ran so deep that they were willing to actively sabotage my success to prove their point. They couldn't stand the thought of me succeeding outside their expectations, and they would rather see me fail completely than admit they had been wrong about my potential. Stephanie's engagement party was scheduled for a Saturday evening at my parents' country club, and despite everything that had happened with my business, I felt obligated to attend. After all, she was still my sister, and I hoped that maybe in a public setting, surrounded by family, friends and David's relatives, everyone would be on their best behavior. I spent money I couldn't afford on a new dress, and tried to psych myself up for an evening of celebrating Stephanie's happiness, while pretending my own life wasn't falling apart. The party was exactly the kind of elegant affair I expected, with carefully arranged flowers, champagne service, and a guest list that included the most prominent families from our social circle. David's parents had flown in from New York, and they seemed charmed by Stephanie's combination of beauty, intelligence, and ambition. I tried to blend into the background, making polite conversation with distant relatives and family friends while avoiding my immediate family as much as possible. But Stephanie had other plans for the evening. About halfway through the party, she called for everyone's attention to make a speech thanking her guests for celebrating with them. What started as a gracious acknowledgement of everyone's support quickly turned into a public humiliation that I should have seen coming. I want to especially thank my parents for always believing in me and supporting my dreams, Stephanie said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Growing up, they taught me the importance of hard work, responsibility, and making smart choices about my future. They showed me that success comes from dedication and planning, not from chasing unrealistic fantasies. She paused, looking directly at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I know it hasn't always been easy for them, especially watching one daughter struggle to find her way while the other has always been focused and driven. The room grew uncomfortably quiet as people began to realize that Stephanie was publicly discussing family issues that should have remained private. But she wasn't finished. My sister Amber is here tonight, and I want everyone to know how much I admire her for exploring her creative side. I know she's been having some financial difficulties with her little art business lately, and it's been hard for our whole family to watch her struggle. But I'm sure she'll figure things out eventually and find something more stable. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger as every person in that room turned to look at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. Stephanie had just announced to approximately 75 people that I was a failure, that my business was struggling, and that my family viewed my career as a childish phase that I needed to grow out of. She had painted herself as the concerned, successful sister and me as the family burden who needed patience and understanding. The conversations that followed were excruciating. Well-meaning family friends approached me with sympathetic smiles and offers of career advice, suggesting I consider going back to school for something more practical, or maybe finding a nice office job with benefits. David's parents gave me looks of polite concern, clearly wondering how their future daughter-in-law came from a family with such an unstable sister. My parents beamed with pride at Stephanie's speech, apparently seeing nothing wrong with her public assessment of my life choices. But the humiliation at the engagement party was just the beginning of an escalation that would nearly destroy me financially and emotionally. The following week, I discovered that someone had used my credit card information to make several large purchases online. The charges totaled nearly $3,000 and included expensive electronics, designer clothing, and luxury spa services. When I contacted my credit card company to report the fraud, they informed me that the purchases had been made using not just my card number, but also my social security number and other personal information that would be difficult for a random stranger to obtain. The investigation into the credit card fraud revealed some disturbing patterns. The items had been shipped to various addresses around the city, but when I tried to track them down, I discovered that most were either fake addresses or temporary mailbox services. However, one of the spa service appointments had been made under a name very similar to mine, and when I called the spa, they confirmed that the appointment had been used by someone who looked like me, but had darker hair and was slightly taller. The description matched Stephanie perfectly. When I tried to explain my suspicions to my parents, they accused me of being paranoid and looking for someone to blame for my financial problems. They suggested that maybe I had been careless with my personal information, or that someone from one of my failed business clients had stolen my data. The possibility that their precious Stephanie could be involved in credit card fraud was apparently so unthinkable that they refused to even consider it. The stress of dealing with the fraud investigation, while trying to keep my business afloat, was taking a serious toll on my physical and mental health. I was having panic attacks at least twice a week, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing and my mind spinning with worry about bills and deadlines, and the growing certainty that my own family was systematically trying to destroy my life. I had lost 12 pounds and developed insomnia, surviving on coffee and determination while trying to rebuild my client base. It was during this dark period that I met Marcus Thompson, who owned a small coffee shop called Grind Coffee, just 2 blocks from my studio. I had been going there every morning for coffee and a quiet place to work on my laptop, and Marcus had noticed my regular presence and obvious stress. He was about 30 years old, with kind eyes and an easy smile that made me feel welcome even when I looked like I hadn't slept in days. One morning, when I was particularly overwhelmed and struggling not to cry over my laptop, Marcus brought me a free coffee and asked if I was okay. Something about his genuine concern broke down my defenses, and I found myself telling him the whole story about my family, my business, and the strange series of setbacks that seemed too orchestrated to be coincidental. Instead of offering empty platitudes or suggesting I was being paranoid, Marcus listened carefully and then said something that changed my perspective completely. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been running this coffee shop for 5 years, and I've learned that when someone really wants to see you fail, they'll find ways to make it happen. But I've also learned that when someone has real talent and determination, like you obviously do, those attacks usually backfire eventually. The question is whether you're going to let them break you down, or use their negativity as fuel to prove them wrong." Marcus became my first real ally in months, and his coffee shop became a sanctuary where I could work without feeling judged or discouraged. He introduced me to other small business owners in the neighborhood who might need design services, and he even offered to let me display some of my portfolio work on the walls of his shop. For the first time since my grandmother's inheritance, I felt like someone believed in my abilities and wanted to see me succeed. But even as I was finding support and starting to rebuild my confidence, my family's attacks were about to escalate to a level that would push me to the absolute breaking point. 2 months after the credit card fraud incident, I walked into my bank to make a deposit from a small freelance project I had managed to secure through Marcus's networking, only to discover that my business account had been completely drained. According to the bank records, someone had authorized a wire transfer of my entire remaining balance, nearly $15,000, to an account I had never heard of. The transfer had been approved using what appeared to be my signature and account information, but I had absolutely no knowledge of the transaction. The bank manager, Mrs. Rodriguez, showed me the paperwork that had authorized the transfer. The documents looked official and included copies of my driver's license and business registration, but something about the signature felt wrong even though it looked remarkably similar to mine. When I explained that I had never authorized this transfer, and had never even heard of the receiving account, Mrs. Rodriguez's expression grew serious. This wasn't just a case of credit card fraud. This was sophisticated financial identity theft that suggested someone with intimate knowledge of my personal and business information. The investigation process was a nightmare that consumed weeks of my time and the last of my emotional reserves. I had to file police reports, work with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, and hire a lawyer to help navigate the complex process of proving that I was the victim of fraud rather than someone trying to hide my own financial mismanagement. The legal fees alone cost me nearly $5,000, money I had to borrow from the small emergency fund I had tried to maintain separate from my business accounts. During this investigation, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The forged documents included not just my signature, but also detailed knowledge of my business operations, client history, and personal financial information that would be nearly impossible for an outsider to obtain. The signature analysis revealed that whoever had forged my name had practiced extensively, creating multiple drafts, until they achieved a nearly perfect match. This wasn't a random crime. It was a calculated attack by someone who had spent considerable time studying my personal and professional life. While I was dealing with the financial investigation, Stephanie returned from medical school for a triumphant homecoming celebration. She had completed her pre-med requirements with highest honors, and had already been accepted into a prestigious residency program at Johns Hopkins Hospital. My parents threw her a party that was even more elaborate than her engagement celebration, inviting everyone they knew to celebrate their daughter's academic achievements and bright future in medicine. The contrast between Stephanie's celebration and my financial crisis couldn't have been more stark. While she was receiving congratulations and gifts from family friends, I was spending my days in lawyers' offices and police stations trying to prove that I hadn't stolen money from myself. My parents made no effort to include me in Stephanie's celebration, and when I did briefly appear at the party, I overheard several conversations about my ongoing problems, and how difficult it must be for my parents to have one successful daughter and one who couldn't seem to get her act together. The worst moment came when I received an eviction notice for my studio space. With my business account drained and no active income, I had fallen 3 months behind on rent, and my landlord was no longer willing to accept promises of future payment. The notice gave me 30 days to pay the outstanding balance of $4,500 or vacate the premises. Looking around the studio I had worked so hard to create, with my grandmother's picture on the desk and my portfolio displayed on the walls, I felt like everything I had built with her inheritance was crumbling around me. My father Robert chose that moment to offer his version of help. He called me into his home office the day after I received the eviction notice, and sat me down with a paternal expression that I now recognize as completely condescending. "Amber," he said with the tone of voice you'd use with a child who had been playing with matches, "your mother and I have been talking, and we think it's time for you to face reality about this business experiment of yours." He went on to explain that they were willing to help me pay the outstanding studio rent and even give me a small loan to get back on my feet, but only if I agreed to close Creative Canvas permanently and find stable employment in a more traditional field. They had even gone so far as to contact some of their business associates about potential office jobs that might be suitable for someone with my artistic background, but would provide the security and benefits that I clearly needed. The offer was presented as generosity, but it felt like a trap designed to force me into admitting failure and accepting their vision of what my life should look like. They wanted me to abandon my dreams, close the business I had built with my grandmother's inheritance, and return to the role of grateful daughter, who had finally learned to appreciate practical advice. In exchange, they would solve my immediate financial crisis and help me start over in a career they deemed acceptable. I knew that accepting their offer would mean giving up everything I had worked for and admitting that they had been right about my artistic pursuits all along. But I also knew that I was running out of options and time. The eviction deadline was approaching, my legal fees were mounting, and I had no idea when or if I would recover the stolen money from my business account. It was during this darkest moment that I received an unexpected phone call that would change the trajectory of my entire situation. The caller identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, the marketing director for a mid-sized technology company that specialized in educational software. She explained that she had seen some of my portfolio work displayed at Marcus's coffee shop, and was interested in discussing a potential project that could involve a complete rebranding of their company's visual identity. The project Jennifer described was substantial: logo design, website development, marketing materials, and a comprehensive style guide that would be implemented across all their business communications. The timeline was ambitious, but manageable, and the budget she mentioned was more than enough to cover my outstanding debts and keep Creative Canvas operating for at least 6 months while I rebuilt my client base. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope that maybe I could salvage my business and prove to my family that their sabotage hadn't succeeded in destroying my dreams. But I also knew that this opportunity represented my last chance to make Creative Canvas work, and if anything went wrong with this project, I would have no choice but to accept defeat and close my business permanently. Working with Marcus to investigate my family's involvement in my financial problems became a turning point in understanding the full scope of what had been done to me. Marcus had suggested that we approach the situation like detectives, systematically documenting evidence and looking for patterns that might help prove who was behind the attacks on my business. What we discovered was far more extensive and coordinated than I had ever imagined. Marcus helped me create a timeline of all the suspicious events that had occurred since I opened Creative Canvas. When we laid everything out chronologically, the pattern became undeniable. Every major setback had occurred shortly after family gatherings where I had shared details about my business progress. The client cancellations had followed dinner conversations where I had mentioned their names and project details. The credit card fraud had occurred within days of me mentioning my financial stress during a family phone call. The bank account theft had happened immediately after I had told my parents about landing the technology company contract. We decided to set up a small recording device in my purse during family visits, hoping to capture evidence of their coordination. The device was tiny and virtually undetectable, and it recorded conversations with crystal clear audio quality. What we captured over the next 2 weeks was damning evidence of a systematic conspiracy that went far beyond simple sabotage. The first breakthrough came when I recorded a conversation between my parents and Stephanie discussing their strategy for handling my business situation. They talked about my inheritance as if it were family money that I had stolen, and they discussed various approaches for forcing me to come to my senses and abandon what they called my artistic delusions. They had been coordinating their attacks carefully, with each family member taking responsibility for different aspects of the sabotage. Stephanie had been handling the client interference and online reputation damage, using fake email accounts and phone numbers to spread false information about my reliability and professionalism. She had created multiple fake personas on social media and review websites, posting negative comments about Creative Canvas and warning potential clients to avoid working with me. Her medical school background had taught her to be methodical and thorough, and she had applied those skills to systematically destroying my professional reputation. My father Robert had been responsible for the financial attacks. As someone with extensive business connections and knowledge of banking procedures, he had been able to obtain copies of my personal information and use his relationships to facilitate the fraudulent transactions. The recording device captured him on the phone with someone, discussing how to make the wire transfer look legitimate while ensuring that the money would be nearly impossible to trace or recover. My mother Helen had been working on the social and emotional warfare, spreading gossip about my financial problems and personal instability throughout our social circle. She had been telling family friends that I was having a nervous breakdown due to the stress of my failed business, and she had been positioning my parents as long-suffering caregivers dealing with a daughter who refused to accept help or guidance. The most shocking revelation came when I recorded a conversation where they discussed bringing David's father into their conspiracy. David's father owned a successful business, and had connections throughout the local professional community, and they wanted him to use his influence to ensure that no legitimate companies would consider hiring Creative Canvas for future projects. They viewed this as a long-term strategy for ensuring that my business would never recover, even if I managed to solve my immediate financial problems. But the recordings also revealed something else. They were genuinely surprised that I hadn't given up yet. They had expected me to come crawling back to them for help weeks earlier, admitting defeat and accepting their guidance about choosing a more stable career path. My persistence in trying to save Creative Canvas was frustrating their timeline and forcing them to escalate their attacks beyond what they had originally planned. Armed with this evidence, I confronted my family during what would become the most explosive dinner conversation of my entire life. I played selected portions of the recordings that clearly demonstrated their coordinated efforts to sabotage my business and steal my inheritance money. I watched their faces as they heard their own voices discussing the specific methods they had used to destroy my reputation and drain my bank accounts. Their initial reaction was complete denial, with each family member claiming that the recordings were somehow fake or taken out of context. Stephanie actually had the audacity to suggest that I had hired actors to stage fake conversations, while my parents insisted that I was having a psychological breakdown and creating elaborate conspiracy theories to explain my business failures. But when I continued playing more recordings, including detailed conversations about specific fraudulent transactions and planned future attacks, their denials became less convincing. Finally, my father lost his temper completely and revealed the depth of his contempt for my choices and my grandmother's support of them. "You want to know the truth, Amber," he shouted. "Your grandmother filled your head with nonsense about being an artist, and now you're throwing away $50,000 on a fantasy business that was never going to succeed. We're your family, and we know what's best for you better than some sentimental old woman who never had to work a real job in her life. Everything we've done has been to save you from wasting your life chasing impossible dreams." The admission of guilt was everything I needed to prove that my suspicions had been correct, but it also revealed the fundamental problem that had poisoned my relationship with my family from childhood. They genuinely believed that their vision of my life was more valid than my own dreams and ambitions. They saw my grandmother's inheritance and support as harmful interference that needed to be corrected through whatever methods necessary. The confrontation ended with me gathering my recordings and evidence and walking out of my parents' house for what I knew would be the last time as their daughter. I had a choice to make. I could use this evidence to fight back legally and publicly, or I could try to move forward and rebuild my life without seeking revenge for what they had done to me. Marcus helped me realize that fighting back wasn't just about revenge. It was about protecting myself from future attacks and potentially helping other people who might be victims of similar family manipulation. We spent the next week consulting with lawyers, financial investigators, and even a private detective who specialized in family fraud cases. What they told me about my legal options and the strength of my evidence gave me the courage to take the next step in reclaiming my life and my business. Building a legal case against my own family felt surreal, but the evidence I had gathered with Marcus's help was comprehensive enough to support multiple criminal charges and civil lawsuits. My attorney, David Kim, was a specialist in financial fraud cases, and he assured me that the recordings, forged documents, and banking records created a clear pattern of conspiracy that would be difficult for my family to defend against in court. The first step was filing criminal complaints with the district attorney's office. The wire fraud charges against my father were particularly serious because they involved interstate banking transactions and forged federal documents. The identity theft charges against Stephanie included not just the credit card fraud, but also the systematic campaign of false information she had spread to damage my business reputation. My mother faced charges related to conspiracy and intentional interference with business relationships. While the criminal investigation was proceeding, I also initiated a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the money they had stolen, the business income one had lost due to their sabotage, and the emotional distress they had caused through their coordinated attacks. David estimated that the total damages could exceed $200,000 when accounting for lost business opportunities, legal fees, and the long-term impact on my professional reputation. But I also decided to wage a strategic public relations campaign that would expose the truth about what had happened to me. Social media had been one of the weapons my family used against me, and I realized it could also be a powerful tool for fighting back. I created a detailed blog post titled, "When Your Own Family Sabotages Your Dreams," which included carefully edited portions of the recordings that demonstrated the scope of their conspiracy, without violating any legal restrictions. The blog post went viral within 48 hours, shared by thousands of people who recognized similar patterns of family manipulation and sabotage in their own lives. The comment section became a support group for people who had experienced everything from parents stealing college funds to siblings sabotaging job interviews. Local news outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the dramatic family conflict and the extensive evidence I had gathered. The timing of my public revelation was carefully calculated to coincide with Stephanie's wedding weekend. I knew that she and David had invited over 200 guests to what was supposed to be the social event of the season, and I wanted to ensure that everyone who attended would know exactly what kind of person they were celebrating. 3 days before the wedding, I released a second blog post that included more detailed evidence and specifically named my family members and their roles in the conspiracy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. David's family began receiving calls from concerned relatives who had read about the fraud charges and were questioning whether they should attend the wedding. Several major vendors, including the florist and photographer, contacted Stephanie to express concerns about being associated with a family under criminal investigation. The country club where the reception was scheduled received numerous calls from members asking about the club's policies regarding events hosted by families involved in financial fraud cases. Stephanie's reaction was predictably dramatic. She called me dozens of times, alternating between tearful pleas and angry threats. She begged me to think about the family and consider the damage I was doing to innocent people like David who had nothing to do with our conflict. When emotional manipulation didn't work, she tried intimidation, threatening to sue me for defamation and claiming that my evidence was fabricated. But the most satisfying response came from the professional community, where my family had tried to destroy my reputation. Several business owners, who had been warned against working with Creative Canvas, reached out to apologize for believing the false information they had received. The technology company that had hired me for the rebranding project publicly endorsed my work and announced that they were recommending me to other companies in their network. Marcus's coffee shop became an informal headquarters for my supporters, with local artists and small business owners stopping by to offer encouragement and share their own stories of overcoming family sabotage. Marcus created a display wall featuring testimonials from my satisfied clients and examples of successful projects I had completed despite my family's interference. The wedding day itself became a public relations disaster for Stephanie and my parents. Media attention had attracted photographers and reporters who gathered outside the country club, and many invited guests chose not to attend rather than be associated with the controversy. David's parents held an emergency family meeting the morning of the wedding, and while they ultimately decided to proceed with the ceremony, several of his relatives boycotted the event. Inside the reception, the atmosphere was tense and uncomfortable. Guests who did attend spent more time discussing the fraud charges and my blog posts than celebrating the marriage. Several people approached David privately to express concerns about his new wife's family and the potential legal and financial complications he might face as Stephanie's husband. The final blow came when David himself pulled me aside during the reception. Instead of the angry confrontation I expected, he seemed genuinely confused and hurt. "I need to know the truth, Amber," he said quietly. "Did Stephanie really do all the things you've accused her of? Because if she did, then I've married someone I don't know at all." I showed David some of the clearer recordings on my phone, including one where Stephanie laughed about how easy it had been to convince my clients that I was unreliable. I watched his face change as he realized that the woman he had just married was capable of systematic deception and manipulation on a level he had never imagined. David's decision to confront Stephanie with the evidence during their wedding reception created a scene that became the talk of local social media for weeks. Stephanie's breakdown was witnessed by dozens of wedding guests, and her admission that everything we did was to help Amber make better choices was recorded by several attendees who shared the videos online. The wedding reception ended early when David announced that he needed time to reconsider their marriage in light of the revelations about Stephanie's character and her family's criminal behavior. The annulment papers were filed within a week, and David's family made it clear that they wanted no further association with the Collins family name. But my counterattack was just beginning, and the legal and social consequences my family would face were going to extend far beyond one ruined wedding. The legal victories came faster than anyone expected, largely because my family's own recorded admissions made it impossible for them to mount an effective defense. Within 3 months of filing the criminal complaints, my father Robert pled guilty to wire fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 18 months in federal prison and full restitution of the stolen funds plus punitive damages. The plea agreement also required him to cooperate with the ongoing investigation into Stephanie's activities. Stephanie's legal situation was more complex because her attacks had been spread across multiple jurisdictions and involved both federal crimes and state-level fraud charges. Her identity theft conviction carried a mandatory minimum sentence, but her cooperation in testifying against our parents reduced her prison time to 8 months in federal custody, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. More importantly for my future security, the restraining order I obtained prohibited her from contacting me or interfering with my business activities for 5 years. My mother Helen avoided prison time by negotiating a plea agreement that required her to pay substantial civil damages and perform 500 hours of community service, but her conviction for conspiracy and intentional interference with business relationships created a permanent criminal record that ended her involvement in several charitable organizations and social clubs, where she had held leadership positions. The civil lawsuit resulted in a total judgment of nearly $300,000, covering not just the money they had stolen, but also lost business income, legal expenses, and punitive damages for the emotional distress they had caused. The payment plan required them to liquidate several assets, including my father's boat and my mother's jewelry collection, and to sell their vacation home in Florida to cover the judgment. But the financial and legal consequences were only part of the broader reckoning that transformed every aspect of my family's social and professional standing. My father's business partnerships dissolved when his associates learned about his conviction for financial fraud, and several major clients cancelled their contracts due to concerns about his trustworthiness. His reputation in the business community, which he had spent decades building, was permanently destroyed. My mother's social circle abandoned her completely when the details of her role in sabotaging her own daughter's business became public knowledge. The country club revoked her membership, and she was asked to step down from the board of directors of 2 nonprofit organizations where she had been active. The isolation was particularly devastating for someone who had defined herself through social status and community involvement. Stephanie's medical career suffered the most severe long-term damage. The Medical Licensing Board launched an investigation into her conviction for identity theft and fraud, questioning whether someone who had demonstrated such systematic dishonesty, could be trusted with patient care. Her residency program at Johns Hopkins was terminated, and she was blacklisted from several other hospitals where she had applied for positions. The investigation also revealed that Stephanie had fabricated portions of her medical school application, including volunteer work and research experience, that she had never actually completed. When this additional academic fraud came to light, her medical degree was suspended pending a comprehensive review of her entire educational record. David's decision to annul their marriage had broader implications than just ending their relationship. His family's legal team had discovered that Stephanie had hidden her criminal charges and pending legal problems during their engagement, which constituted fraud in the marriage contract itself. The annulment was granted on grounds of fraudulent inducement, which meant that legally, their marriage had never existed. But the most personally satisfying aspect of the reckoning was watching the truth emerge about my family's treatment of me over the years. Extended family members, family friends, and community acquaintances began reaching out to apologize for believing my parents' stories about my instability and poor judgment. Many people admitted that they had always sensed something was wrong with how differently my parents treated their daughters, but they had assumed there must be good reasons for the favoritism. My Aunt Patricia, my father's sister, called to tell me that she had always suspected my parents of manipulating situations to favor Stephanie, but she had never imagined the extent of their coordinated sabotage. She shared stories about family gatherings where my accomplishments had been deliberately downplayed while Stephanie's achievements were exaggerated and celebrated. Several of my childhood teachers reached out through social media to express their regret about not intervening when they had noticed the stark difference in how my parents supported their daughter's education and activities. My high school art teacher, Mrs. Morrison, told me that she had tried multiple times to convince my parents to nurture my artistic talents, but they had always dismissed her recommendations as impractical encouragement. The public attention my story received also created unexpected opportunities for creative canvas. The blog posts and media coverage had essentially become a case study in overcoming family sabotage and building a business despite systematic opposition. Entrepreneurs and small business owners began contacting me for both design services and consulting advice about dealing with family interference in their professional lives. The technology company that had hired me during my darkest period became my strongest advocate, referring several major clients and publicly endorsing my work in their industry publications. The successful completion of their rebranding project, delivered on time and under budget despite my family's attempts at interference, became a powerful testimonial to my resilience and professional capabilities. Marcus's support throughout the entire ordeal had evolved from friendship into something deeper, and we began discussing both business and personal partnerships that represented the kind of authentic relationship I had never experienced within my biological family. His coffee shop had become an informal gallery space for creative canvas work, and we were exploring the possibility of expanding both our businesses into a shared creative space that would support other local artists and entrepreneurs. The final legal hearing, where my family members were formally sentenced and the civil judgment was finalized, felt like closing a chapter on the first 26 years of my life and opening a completely new story about who I wanted to become and what kind of success actually mattered to me. The journey from being the overlooked daughter to becoming an empowered entrepreneur was neither quick nor easy, but it taught me lessons about resilience, authenticity, and the difference between family and people who truly care about your well-being. 2 years after the legal cases were resolved, Creative Canvas had grown from a struggling one-person studio into a thriving agency, with 4 full-time employees and a waiting list of clients who specifically sought us out because of our reputation for innovative design and authentic storytelling. The success wasn't just measured in financial terms, although the business was certainly profitable enough to provide security and growth opportunities one had never imagined possible. More importantly, I had created a work environment that reflected my values and supported other creative professionals who might be struggling against family disapproval or social pressure to choose more practical careers. 2 of my employees were young artists whose families had initially opposed their creative pursuits, and I took particular satisfaction in providing them with the support and encouragement I had never received. My personal healing process required professional therapy to address the deep psychological damage that decades of family manipulation and favoritism had created. Dr. Sarah Chen, my therapist, helped me understand that the dysfunction in my family had been systematic and intentional, not the result of my own inadequacies or failures. Learning to recognize and trust my own instincts, after years of being told they were wrong, was one of the most challenging aspects of recovery. The therapy also helped me process the complex emotions I felt about my family's downfall. While I felt vindicated and relieved that the truth had been exposed, I also grieved for the family relationships I had always hoped to have but now knew were impossible. Learning to let go of the fantasy of eventually earning my parents' approval, or having a genuine sisterly relationship with Stephanie, required accepting that some people are incapable of love without conditions or competition. I maintained minimal contact with my biological family, primarily through lawyers, and only when legal or financial matters required communication. My parents had attempted several reconciliation efforts, usually timed to coincide with holidays or family milestones, but their apologies consistently focused on asking for forgiveness rather than demonstrating any genuine understanding of the harm they had caused or commitment to change. Stephanie's situation had continued to deteriorate even after her criminal sentence was completed. The medical licensing board had permanently revoked her credentials, and she had been unable to find employment in any healthcare-related field due to her fraud convictions. Her attempts to rebuild her career in other industries were hampered by background checks that revealed her criminal history. She had made several attempts to contact me through mutual acquaintances, but I maintained the boundaries established in the restraining order. The chosen family I built through friendship and professional relationships became far more supportive and nurturing than my biological family had ever been. Marcus and I had married in a small ceremony at his coffee shop, surrounded by the artists, entrepreneurs, and small business owners who had become our real community. Our relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine support for each other's dreams and goals. My Aunt Patricia had become an unexpected ally and the only biological family member with whom I maintained a genuine relationship. She had divorced herself from my parents' social circle and had begun questioning other family dynamics that she had previously accepted without examination. Her grandchildren knew me as their successful, independent aunt who had overcome difficult circumstances through determination and courage. Creative Canvas had evolved beyond just a design agency into a platform for supporting other entrepreneurs who were building businesses despite family opposition or social pressure. I had started a blog and podcast series called Building Your Own Path, which shared stories of people who had succeeded in unconventional careers despite discouragement from their families. The response had been overwhelming, with thousands of listeners sharing their own experiences and finding encouragement to pursue their authentic goals. The community involvement that grew from my business success felt more meaningful than any social status my family had ever pursued. I served on the board of directors for a non-profit organization that provided business mentorship and small loans to artists and creative entrepreneurs. The scholarship fund I established in my grandmother Rose's name had helped 12 young artists attend art school or start creative businesses, despite family financial pressure to choose different paths. Marcus and I had purchased a beautiful old Victorian house that we were renovating to include studio space for Creative Canvas and expanded seating for his coffee shop. The project represented everything I valued about authentic success: creating something beautiful and functional that served our community while reflecting our personal values and aesthetic vision. The relationship with my inheritance money had also evolved in ways my grandmother would have appreciated. The initial $50,000 had grown into a business worth several times that amount, but more importantly, it had created ongoing income that allowed me to support other artists and creative entrepreneurs through loans, grants, and business partnerships. Every quarter, I donated a portion of Creative Canvas profits to organizations that supported people escaping family manipulation or building independence despite social pressure. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that my family's sabotage had actually strengthened my business and my character in ways that easy success might not have achieved. The skills I developed in investigating their conspiracy, documenting evidence, and fighting legal battles had made me a more thorough and strategic business owner. The resilience I built while surviving their attacks had prepared me for other challenges that inevitably arose in entrepreneurship. The most profound change was in how I defined success and family. Success was no longer about earning approval from people who were incapable of giving it genuinely. It was about building a life that reflected my values and provided both personal satisfaction and positive impact on others. Family was no longer determined by blood relationships, but by mutual care, respect, and support for each other's authentic selves. The final lesson my grandmother Rose had intended me to learn through her inheritance was that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the resources and encouragement to build their own path, even when that path looks different from what others expect or approve of. Her belief in my potential had given me not just financial support, but also the validation that my dreams were worth pursuing despite family opposition. As I write this conclusion, Creative Canvas is preparing to open a second location, and Marcus and I are planning to start a family of our own. The children we raise will grow up knowing that their worth is not determined by comparison to siblings or conformity to parental expectations, but by their own character, kindness, and commitment to using their unique talents to make the world a little better. What happened to me was painful and damaging, but it also taught me that authentic success means building a life that honors your true self rather than trying to earn love from people who can only love you conditionally. Sometimes the greatest victory is not proving your family wrong, but proving to yourself that you never needed their approval to live a meaningful and successful life. I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like the overlooked child in your family? Or have you experienced sabotage from people who were supposed to support your dreams? Share your story in the comments below because your experience might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it, and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family dysfunction and building authentic success. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need encouragement to pursue their dreams despite family pressure. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth is not determined by other people's approval, even when those people are family. Wishing you the courage to build your own path, and the wisdom to recognize the people who truly deserve a place in your life.